Over the past year, the concept of sustainable finance has continued to evolve. Mark Spicer is with me today to talk about this and broader environmental issues. Welcome, Mark. Last year, you and I spoke about the increasing focus on environmental, social and governance issues. In your mind, what has changed since last year?
Yeah, good question. So there haven't been any massive changes in the ESG space, but I think it's been a continuing trajectory towards higher standards and more integration of ESG into financial decision making. One thing that we have seen, and it's a study between KPMG and the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia, and that is an increase in the funds under management that are under a responsible investment strategy, so ESG strategies over those investments. Year on year, we've seen a 17% increase in funds under management, and now that represents well over a third of funds professionally managed in Australia. We're also seeing an increase in the level of climate risk reporting across financial institutions and increasing commitments around that. And one of the impacts of that is we've seen the larger banks putting out statements around screening out certain types of asset from their loan portfolio. So a number of the larger banks will no longer issue loans to thermal coal businesses and will start to remove or not renew loans to thermal coal. So they'll be totally out of that by 2025, 2030 this year. We're also seeing in a parallel research by RIA, Australian banking customers looking to move or indicating a willingness to move banks if the banks are investing funds in a way that's not aligned with the customer's belief sets. So we've heard up to 75% of banking customers would look to move if the investments aren't aligned.
So based on what you've talked about there, Mark, what are the first steps that mutuals need to consider when they're thinking about climate risks?
Thanks. Yeah, good question. I think the first step has to be to identify where those risks are across the loan portfolio. And there are a couple of main pockets of risk. The first is physical. So how much of your loans or how many of your loans are exposed to physical risk, be that cyclone, bushfire, sea level rise, flooding, those sorts of physical risks. And what exposure do you have to that? And also to the cost of maintenance and upkeep in the face of increasing risk of physical impact. The second is around transitional risks. These are slightly more complicated potentially, but if you think about the profitability or the ability of your customers to repay loans, if there were to be a cost of carbon imposed, either locally or globally, does that increase the credit risk at all across your portfolio? And also another consideration might be an exposure to highly carbon intense businesses within your communities, impacting on the ability for mortgagees to repay their loans. The response to that, there's probably two key elements. One is to consider those risks in the loan origination, to try and temper or think about your exposure to the physical or transition risks when giving out loans. And the second would be thinking about the resilience of existing customers. So what's their resilience to the physical risk and what's their resilience to transition risk, and what can the mutual do to help increase the understanding and that resilience in their customer base.
And so beyond climate, what are the first steps that mutuals need to think about in their broader ESG strategy?
Thanks, that's a great question. We are seeing a lot of banks and financial institutions setting ESG strategies, and there are a couple of really critical steps. I think the first one for me is the understanding your key stakeholders. Who are they? And what are the issues that matter most to them? And for mutuals, that's most likely to be customers and communities. So it's really a case of drilling down into those customers and communities and understanding what environmental and social issues really matter to them. Once you've understood that, setting a clear strategic response supported by targets is the next really critical step. Getting buy-in from senior executives is the next cab off the rank. And then finally, reporting your understanding, your strategic response, and your performance clearly to your key stakeholders is critical for that ESG to be successful and to create value within the business. If done well, this communication to your members should demonstrate that you understand what they're after, you're setting good targets, you're making a change, you're having a positive impact. If that's communicated well, that should really resonate with your customer and your other key communities.